DynamoDB charges for reading, writing, and storing data in your DynamoDB tables. As a rule of thumb, when querying data, you can consider each record that you retrieve has a direct cost attached to it. So using pagination and limiting the number of records that you retrieve for your users and application has a direct impact on saving cost and also performance. In this video, let's learn how to implement pagination when querying and retrieving data from DynamoDB. We will look at the code examples using .NET, but the same concepts apply to other programming languages as well. We will learn how to use the LastEvaluatedKey, the ExclusiveStartKey, limit, and the ScanIndexForward properties in DynamoDB and how to implement pagination with that. Hello everyone, my name is Rahul and I work as a software engineer based out of Brisbane, Australia. If you're new here, I make videos on .NET, Cloud, and DevOps. This video is sponsored by AWS and is part of my .NET on AWS series. Without much delay, let's get straight into learning all about pagination when working with DynamoDB tables. Pagination in general is the process by which you split large dataset into smaller chunks or groups so that they can be fetched independently and incrementally. You would have come across this in common UI patterns where you have a next page or you have explicitly numbered pages and you can navigate through them and load those specific pages. Now, with DynamoDB, which is designed as a distributed system to store large amounts of data, tables and data are stored in partitions. Now, these partitions necessarily need not be on the same server, which means you cannot implement the normal page-style pagination using DynamoDB, unless you're willing to incur a significant cost and also performance issues. Now, with DynamoDB, it's more easier to implement UI styles like infinite scroll or continuous scrolling, where you load the data as you scroll to the end of the dataset. So let's get to learn how we can implement that using .NET and DynamoDB. Now, if you're completely new to DynamoDB and just getting started, I highly recommend checking out my video on getting started with DynamoDB. It will be linked here and also in the descriptions below. Let's go to Rider, which is the IDE that I will be using to demo the code today, but this should be possible with Visual Studio as well or any other IDE that you're using. Now, I have a solution already set up. This is the same solution that I used in my previous video where I showed you the different querying possibilities when using DynamoDB. Now, if you're new to querying and retrieving data from DynamoDB, I highly recommend checking out that video where I build up this solution from a default ASP.NET Core Web API template. Now, as a quick recap, we have the program.cs, the weather forecast, and also the weather forecast controller. I have added different API endpoint methods here based on the different querying patterns. Now, when we explored this video, we saw the high-level API, which used the DynamoDB context, and also the low-level API, which used the Amazon DynamoDB client. Now, when you're using pagination, we need to use the lower level APIs as the properties that supports pagination is only exposed in that API. Now, these two different APIs are provided by the same DynamoDB NuGet package, which I have already added in my project as a dependency. So you can see under the packages, there is the AWS SDK.DynamoDB v2 NuGet package. So let's scroll down and add a new method to this API endpoint where we will explore pagination. Now, all the source code is uploaded and the link is there in the descriptions below. So let's copy and paste this exact same method, which is the city name low-level expressions that we used, and let's modify that to see how pagination works. So let's copy that and put it right below the scan method. Now let's rename this method so that it doesn't conflict. So let's say get all for city, and this makes it paged at the end. So let's remove these unnecessary parameters. So let's just have the city name for now. So let's remove the filter expression, which was something I had added in the previous method. Let's remove these expression attribute names, which is not required anymore. Let's remove this additional parameters as well. Now all this has is the expression city name, So let's modify this expression to just look at the city name, pass in the city name, and get the response. Now let's also change the route name. So in this case, let's name it as city name paged. Now let's put a breakpoint here and run this to make sure everything is working as expected. The application is running and we have the Swagger UI launched. Now the new method that we just added is right here. So let's try it out and pass in the city name. So let's give this as Brisbane and click execute. Now this hits our endpoint and it returns the data as expected. So let's collapse this. Let's step through this, get the response.items, and we see this has 20 items right now. Now if we expand the response object to see the other properties, we can see the last evaluated key as a property and it says it has 0 items. Now this is because this particular query has loaded all the items from our DynamoDB, which is all the 20 items for this particular city. Now that's the total data that I have for this particular city. Now in these cases, it is not necessary to page because you have all the results in a single request, and also it does not take that much of space going back and forth from DynamoDB. But once your database grows and you have more items in your database, let's say you have thousands of weather data information, in these cases you particularly don't want to load all the data back into your server or onto your UI. These are the cases where you would start using pagination and page your data so that the user can look through them as required. Now when using DynamoDB, a simple query operation will read up to the maximum number of items set. Now the maximum number of items is limited by the limit parameter or by a maximum of 1 MB of data. Now if the DynamoDB objects are larger in size, let's say you have more data in them or you have some images stored inside them, the size of the object would naturally grow. In these cases, that would limit the number of records that get returned back. Now let's say if querying just 3 of the objects reached the 1 MB limit, then I would only get 3 objects back in my response. But in my particular case, these objects were well under the 1 MB limit, which is why all 20 of them came back. The other way that pagination kicks in is when you have the limit property. So let's come back to our code and let's stop this and let's add the limit property. So let's add limit and specify to limit to 5 items. Now if we go to the definition of limit, you can see this is the maximum number of items to evaluate. Now if DynamoDB processes the number of items up to the limit while processing the results, it stops the operation and returns the matching values. Now in this case, the last evaluated key will apply to the subsequent operation so that you can pick up from where you left off. So the last evaluated key shows till what data this limit reached while picking the records. Now even when you specify a limit, if by reading 3 records it has already reached the 1 MB limit, then you would only get back the 3 records, even though you specified 5. So the limit is only the maximum number of records that you would receive in that particular request. It could also be less than that. So let's run this again and see how this has made a difference to our API endpoint. Now if I go back to the city page, let's say try it out and let's specify Brisbane and execute again. Now it's hit the breakpoint. Let's step through the execution, and this time when we expand the response and look at the number of items returned, you can see it has only returned number 5. You can also see that the last evaluated key has a count of 2. Now if we expand that, you can see it has 2 properties. It has 2 attribute value pairs. Now if I expand both of them, you can see it's the city name and the date pair, which is the primary key for my table. Now this has values that responds to the last key that was read. So you can see this read until 2023 01 22nd, which is January 22nd. So let's return this execution. Let's navigate back to Swagger and you can see the results in here. Here it started retrieving the data from 2023 01 19, which is January 19th. So if I scroll down, you can see the data all the way till January 23rd. Now we can use the last evaluated key from the response in our subsequent request to return the next set of data. Let's see how we can implement that. Now if I was to make another call with the same endpoint right now, I would still be getting the same set of records because DynamoDB doesn't know to start from that particular point again. It just starts from the start, which is the 19th of January, which is where my data starts. So let's stop this execution. Let's pass in the key to explicitly start from. So let's pass a key from in our endpoint. So let's specify string page key. Now this could be optional because the very first time I'm making the call, I wouldn't have any page key and I'll have to pass in a null. So let's leave this as an optional parameter and let's pass the page key into the query request. But before that, let's also return the page key back to the query so that it can request it the next time. So let's update our response items. So let's create a new class to hold the paged result. So let's create a new class right under this project. So let's create a class. Let's call this as paged result. Now let's make this as a generic class so that we can pass in any type of result. So let's also put the constraint. Let's say where t is of type class. Let's add a property to this. So let's say this is going to be a list of t and let's call this as items. Now we also need to specify the key. So let's add a string property and let's call this as next page key. Now when we return the data, so let's come back to the weather forecast controller. Let's collapse this. So instead of returning directly, let's put this in a variable. So let's say this is going to be the items. Now we can convert this to a list because we have given this as a list property. So let's specify a list and let's return the paged result class. So let's return new paged result and let's specify the items as the items collection. Now we also need the next page key. This is going to be a string value. So let's specify next page key as a property. Let's explicitly specify the type in this case, which is going to be weather forecast. And let's also update our return type. So in this case, this is going to be paged result and weather forecast. Now to create the next page key, let's use the last evaluated key from the response. So let's specify the var next page key is equal to. So from the response, we have the last evaluated key, which needs to be converted into a string. Now, right now, this is a dictionary of string and attribute value pair. We saw this when we used the low-level APIs, and the items were also getting returned as a dictionary and string attribute value pair. This is how the low-level API represents a DynamoDB item. In this particular case, the last evaluated key just has the primary key pair and not the other properties. Now to convert this into a string, let's first JSON serialize this object and then convert it as base 64. So let's start with convert.toBase64, which allows us to convert any data to a base 64 string. So let's call the base 64 string. This accepts a byte array. So let's convert this as a JSON serialized byte array. Now for this, let's use the JSON serializer and specify the serialize object and pass in the object that we are going to serialize. In this case, the last evaluated key. We also need to specify the options so that the serialization works in a specific manner. So let's create a new JSON serializer options and let's specify the default ignore condition. So let's specify the JSON ignore condition and specify when writing default. This is so that when they're writing default properties, it ignores those properties. This is required to successfully serialize the string attribute value pair that's coming back from DynamoDB. So let's make sure to close this. Now, since we need a byte array, let's call the serialize to UTF-8 bytes method. This is similar to the serialize method, but it serializes to UTF-8 bytes. Now, this conversion is working appropriately. So now we first convert the response.lastEvaluatedKey, which is a dictionary key value pair, into a serialized UTF-8 byte and then further convert that into a base 64 string. Now once we get the paged key, we are returning it back in our paged result. Now this returns the page key, which we can then use in our request that comes in optionally inside as part of the page key parameter. So let's use this. So let's specify where ExclusiveStartKey, because that is the start key where we want to start from. So let's first convert this from the base 64 to normal bytes. So let's specify convert dot from base 64 string, which returns it as a byte array. So let's get the byte array from the page key and then deserialize this using JSON serializer. So let's specify JSON serializer dot deserialize, and let's specify the property type. So in this case, this is going to be dictionary of string and attribute value pair. So let's specify that, and let's pass in this bytes that's getting converted from base 64. Now once we have that, we should be able to use the exclusive start key. Now in some cases, the page key is going to be null. So in these cases, let's simply leave this as null. So let's check for string.is null or empty of page key in this particular scenario. And let's pass, if that is the case, return null. If it's not, do the conversion and get the deserialized object. Now once we have the exclusive start key, we can pass it inside our query request. So right after limit, so let's specify exclusive start key, which is also a property of the same type, which is dictionary of string and attribute value. So let's specify the exclusive start key that we just got. Now if we go into the definition of exclusive start key, you can see the primary key of the first item that this operation will evaluate. Use the value that was returned from the last evaluated key in the previous operation. So anytime we make a request into this API, we get the previous evaluated key and return that as part of response, which can then be used in the subsequent call to the API as a paged request. Now normally in a pagination API, you would be passing the page number and the page size as parameters. Now since we cannot use page number and directly page using pages, we are using the last evaluated key to mark our page location. Now the limit could always be passed in as a parameter. So you could make this as a parameter and specify the count from the UI. However, note that this limit need not be always the number of items that gets returned, like we saw with the size, etc. So let's run this again and see how this is working. Now we have the Swagger UI opened again, so let's expand the method, try it out, and let's specify Brisbane. The first request, I do not have any page key, so let's click execute, which executes this request. Now if I step through this, you can see it makes the query request, the response, and it gets all the items. Now in this case, we do have a response.lastEvaluatedKey, which now is converted into a base 64 string and responded back as the page result. So let's continue the execution. Let's go back to the Swagger UI, and in the results, we see the same set of results. So it starts from January 19th and goes all the way till January 23rd. But in addition to that, we also have the next page key. So let's copy this value, which is the base 64 string, and let's pass this as part of our next request. So let's paste this in here and click execute. Now since the page key is passed in, let's step over. Now the exclusive start key is rebuilt from that base 64 string. Now this passes the city name and the explicit date attribute value, which is the 22nd of January. Now if we execute past this request and continue the execution, let's navigate back to the Swagger UI, and here you can see the data from the next set, which is from 24th January onwards. So if you scroll down, you can see the values up until 28th. Now if I was to copy this new page key that I have and pass this as part of my request again, so let's remove that and paste in the new properties. You can see this time the exclusive start key has a different value for the date time. So if I expand this, this has the value of 27th. Now this is going to explicitly start this request from that key onwards. which means you would be getting back the data from that particular key. Now, when it reaches the last page, it will return a null page key, which is when you know there are no more items in your DynamoDB database for that particular query. So if we copy this again and paste this as part of the values and click execute. Now in this request, if we step over this again, we can look at the response, and this is the final response because you can see the last evaluated key is 0. Now if we further step over, you can see that the next page key is still generating a value. So let's fix this and respond this as a null so that the UI explicitly knows that the page size limit has reached. So let's stop this and let's make this as a null if the last evaluated key count is 0. So let's add an additional check. So let's say response.lastEvaluatedKey.count is greater than 0, or if it's equal to 0, then let's return null. Else, let's do the conversion. So let's make sure to format this and let's debug this again. Now I have the last page key already here. So let's click execute. Now this hits the last record. So let's step through again. Now the response is exactly the same. So let's get the next page key, which this time is going to be null. So let's F5 this. And if we come back to our UI, you can see the list of records and the next page key is null. This indicates that you have reached the end of the page. Now using this, you can implement a continuous scroll so that you can keep scrolling using the next page key and passing it to the next set of requests to the API endpoint until you reach the next page key as null. Now when we looked at the last evaluated key, we saw that it is just the key value of the primary key attribute, which means we can update this method to just take in a date time, which indicates the range key for that particular record. So you can pass in the maximum date time of the data you have already seen and use that to create the exclusive start key. So let's see an example of that. So let's copy this city name paged, the whole method, and let's create a new method with exactly the similar structure. So let's change this name. So let's say get all city paged with range key. And let's do the same for the route as well with range key. Now instead of passing in a page key, let's simply pass in a date time, which can be nullable again. So let's say from date time. So this is the maximum date time that you have seen already in the response so that we can explicitly start from that particular date time. Now instead of doing a deserialization, we need to create that particular document object. So let's specify the dictionary of string and attribute value. Let's specify this as ExclusiveStartKey is equal to null. Now, if the from datetime has a value, so let's say from datetime dot has value. In this case, let's create a new document. So let's say ExclusiveStartKey is equal to new document, which is again coming from the DynamoDB v2, and this uses the document model. We used this earlier when we were converting the response back into the type. So we use the document.fromAttribute method. Now in this particular case, we will be creating this to create the string and attribute value pair. So let's specify a new document. We need to create a new document here. So let's specify var doc. Let's specify the properties. So in this case, let's specify the name of, let's use weather forecast dot city name, and let's pass the city name, which we already have as the value. Let's also specify the date time. So let's specify the name of and use the date property, which is weather forecast dot date. And let's pass this as the from date time value. Now, since this is nullable, let's specify dot value, and let's also convert this to a string. Now we use the AWS SDK utils to specify the date format. Now once we have the document, we can use the toAttributeMap method to convert this to a string and attribute value pair, which is what the ExclusiveStartKey expects. So let's use that method and let's set this to be the ExclusiveStartKey. So now if we have a date time in here, we are converting it explicitly to that string attribute value pair, using the document object in DynamoDB. So once we have the exclusive start key, let's set that in our request as before. Now, if you still want to return a page key, you can make it as the maximum value in the response. So let's say items.maxBy, and let's specify a property. So let's say the date, and let's convert that to string. So if the value is null or empty, let's ignore that. So let's put question mark dot date dot toString, and again use the AWS SDK utils and specify the date format. Now we are simply getting the max value of the items that's returned by the date and passing that date as the next page key. So when that is coming in again, it will create the explicit document pointer for that exclusive start key. So let's run this and make sure this is working as expected. Now we have the new method by the range key. Let's call the try it out, and let's specify Brisbane as the value. Now let's click execute. The from date time is null, which means it will return the first page of data. So you can see it starts from 19th of January and goes all the way till 23rd. Now it also specifies the maximum key is the 23rd that this has seen. So let's copy that. Let's pass that from the from date time, and let's click execute again. Now in this case, it starts the records from 24th, which is the next key in that particular range of data. Now this goes on till we have the last record. In this case, you can also arbitrarily start the value from any record. So let's say I want the records from the 20th of January. I can do that as well. So now it returns the data from the 21st and gets all the data from there. Now if I was to say this as 29th, it starts from the 29th of January, which means it's going to return the data from 30th. So using this method by explicitly specifying the range key and starting from that position, you can skip over the records as you want. Now if you go to the last page, let's say the second, and call the 05 in here, which is the February 5th, and execute that, we're going to get the two records, and then there is no more records in here. Now again, since it has already run out of records, we should be fixing our code so that it returns a null in the max date time. So let's stop this. Let's navigate down, and in the place where we are doing the max, let's check if the last evaluated key is empty or not. So let's look at the response dot LastEvaluatedKey.count is equal to 0. If that is the case, let's return null. If not, let's return the maximum value. Now we can also use the .any method. So it's checking if it does not have any, then it returns null. If not, it returns the maximum value. Now let's run this again. I already have the query here for the last sec. So let's click execute, which executes through, and we return the next page key as null. Now this shows that we have reached the end of the page and we cannot query it again. Until now, we were paging forward through the data. What if we want to page backwards? This is the case, we can use an additional property on the request to specify the paging direction. So let's go back to our request and let's look at the property ScanIndexForward, and let's set it to be false. Now this has a default value of true. Now the ScanIndexForward specifies the order for index traversal. Now by default, it is performed in the ascending order, which is why we saw the date going from the smaller value to the higher value. Now if this value is false, the traversal is performed in a descending order, which means we will be starting from the end of the range key and then going backwards on that. Now let's run this and see how this behaves. Now we have again this method. So let's call the try it out and let's pass in the Brisbane without any dates. So let's pass in Brisbane and click execute. Now in this case, you can see it has started from the last date, which is the February of 7th, and it's going backwards to 6th, 5th, and so on. Now in this particular case, we should be returning the next page key as the minimum value instead of the maximum value. So we'll need to go back and fix our API endpoints. Now to be explicit for the scanning backward and forwards, it's better to use an API URL path or pass in explicit parameters as part of the API. So let's stop this and do exactly that. So let's collapse this. let's come back to our controller method. Let's pass in an additional property. Let's call this as bool, and let's simply specify forward. You can also use string parameters like next and back, or you can even put it as two different API endpoints by specifying /next and /next in the URLs itself. So let's for now just use the isForward property, and let's use that for ScanIndexForward. So let's specify isForward, and let's give this a default value to be true, which means it's going to scan as forward, which is the default for ScanIndexForward as well. Now, based on this value, we'll have to switch between the max and the min. So in here, let's specify isForward. If that is the case, let's get the max. If that is not the case, let's get the items.minimum and get the value from that. So let's specify min by and do the exact same thing. Let's also make sure to end the statement and run this to check if it's working as expected. So let's navigate to the new method. Let's pass in a city name. So let's give this as Brisbane. Let's give this as true and click execute. Now this starts from the starting of the data set, which is the January of 19th. Now if I was to switch this to false and click execute, this is going to start from the end, which is the February of 7th. Now if I was to use the minimum value, so let's scroll down, and you can see here the value is 02 3rd, which is the 3rd of February. So let's copy that and let's use that in the from date time and click execute. Now here it starts returning back the data from 023 and returns the value from there on. Now you can see this returns the 022, 1 and so on data in our result set. Now once we have the next set of page, you can go through that again. So let's paste that in the from data and let's click execute. Now if you want to see the last set, so let's come back to 20th of January and click execute, and this is going to return null in the next page key because the next page after this does not exist. Now at any point, you can also start moving forward by passing in true, and this will start returning the data with the value that is going to scan forward. And it will start from the next value from the date that we have passed in. Now since we have given 20, it's going to start from 21 and return the data upwards. So let's come back. Let's stop this. Now to set the starting point of the page, we were setting the value of ExclusiveStartKey. That is a property on the query request. But we can also set it as part of the KeyConditionExpression. Now since the only additional condition on the ExclusiveStartKey is the range, we can specify that as part of the KeyConditionExpression as well. So let's see an example by copying and pasting this and creating a new method. Now I'm duplicating these methods so that you can go through the code later when I publish this on the channel. So let's create a new method. Let's call this as getAllForCityPaged with condition. So let's change this as well, city name paged, range key condition. So instead of creating the exclusive start key, so let's remove this. In this particular case, let's remove this as well. Now let's update the key condition expression. So by passing the city name as the value, let's also pass the and let's specify the date condition. So we saw since date is a reserved keyword, we need to pass that as parameterized as well. So let's specify the hash date and let's specify greater than, assuming that this is going to look forward. Now we can create a different condition expression when we are going to go backward. So let's remove this for now, assuming it's always going to be forward. Let's also remove the ScanIndexForward. Now we can say greater than or equal to, or simply greater than, because we have the last value. So let's specify the from date as the value in this particular case. So let's specify from date time. Now we saw to pass the date value, we need to pass this as part of the attribute names list. So let's create a new string mapping. Let's pass in the new value, which is going to be the hash date, and let's pass the actual property name. Now this is required because date is a reserved keyword. We saw that in my query video, which is linked in the descriptions below. Now let's also pass the additional parameter, which is the from date time. So let's pass the value for that. Let's create it from the from date time. Let's convert the value to a string. So let's use the same AWS SDK utils .to ISO format. Now you can conditionally pass this value if the date time is null. Now for now, I'll always pass in the date time just to show you as an example. But you can modify the request with an if-else if the date time is null and when it is not. So now we have both the values set inside here. Let's run this to make sure this is working as expected. So let's run again. Now with the request modified, let's scroll down and let's remove the isForward check for now because that is always going to be true. So let's remove that and let's simply get the max items for now. But you know how to update this code if you want to support the isForward property as well. Now with that all set, let's run this to make sure this is working as expected. Now the Swagger UI is up, so let's use the new endpoint and let's pass try it out. So let's give the city name as Brisbane. Let's also give an arbitrary date time. So let's use the clipboard manager because I have a date in there that I had copied before. Now to open the clipboard manager, all you need to do is Windows and the V key. So let's paste in that date and let's click execute. Now this should be returning the data from the 30th and onwards. So let's scroll down and you can see this has returned the data from 31st and it gets the next set of data. Now for the last set, so let's copy this value, which is from February, and let's click execute. In this case, the next page key still returns null. So we can conditionally set the key condition expression and use that for pagination as well, instead of explicitly setting the exclusive start key. I'm not sure if there is any difference between these two ways of pagination. However, I will update the associated blog post of this video in case I find any differences. You can find the link to the blog post in the descriptions below. Now, in all these cases, we saw that it's important to look at the response.LastEvaluatedKey to check if there is other items inside the request. Now, if this is returning as empty, it means it has reached the end of that particular page. Now, when you're using filter expressions as part of your queries, you can run into a response where the last evaluated key still has a value, but there would be no records in the return items. Now, there are certain things that you need to be aware of when you're using filter expression along with pagination. If you're interested to learn more about that, please let me know in the comments below and I'll create a new video for that. I hope this helps you to understand about pagination when dealing with DynamoDB. We learned different ways how you can pass in the start key for the page in the request parameters. But we also learned that the last evaluated key is what shows whether there's more data inside the current query results or not. But we saw that the most important property is the last evaluated key, which shows if there is further data to be retrieved or not. Now you can choose one of the methods to pass the input parameter by either using it as a base 64 string or explicitly passing in the date time or even specifying it in the key condition expressions. Based on your application and needs, pick a method that works for you. We also learned how to go back and forth in your page using the ScanIndexForward property. If you like this video, please make sure to hit the like button. If you want to be notified of future such videos, please hit the subscribe button. It also helps me to grow this YouTube channel. Thank you and see you soon in the next video.